I will now turn this over to Suzaan Boettger. She will give us a historically contextualized overview of the issues and works of art regarding the intersection of earth and site-specific art that emerged in the 1960s and its collectors and patrons. Please give Suzaan a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Samantha, for your generous conception of this symposium, with Margaret Laster assisting you. Very adventurous, and your gracious administration of that. And my appreciation, I want to say, to dear friends and colleagues who showed up with enthusiasm and curiosity. A sip. Let us go then to when the evening was spread out against the sky, not like Eliot's patient etherized upon a table, but with Robert Smithson at 28, animatedly talking and gesturing as he was so wont to do. It is July 1966. He is on the eve of signing on to be an artist consultant to a New York firm proposing a design for the future Dallas-Fort Worth airport. The process inspired his idea for sculpture between runways flat on the earth. He would go on to conceptualize what he called land projects of the earth. And 4 years later, in 1970, in Utah's Great Salt Lake, built the 1,500 feet long coil, the spiral jetty, famously photographed by Gianfranco Giorgione. That evening, Smithson left his downtown Greenwich Street apartment, not for the place he regularly carried on, the artist's salon, Max's Kansas City on Park Avenue South, but further up Park Avenue. He and his wife and partner, Nancy Holt, partied in the sky at the home of collectors, Barbara and Eugene Schwartz, who 21 years later, during the time when fate had brought me to that penthouse to administer their collection, made the cover of New York Magazine as exemplars of 80s art fever. That is, the delirium of bagging a big one, like their Kiefer, Germany's spiritual heroes, sold the next year to Eli Broad and presently on view in that museum, or their Frank Stella, Die Fahne hoch, that Smithson would have stood before that night, and we can do so when the Whitney shows it. We start with the artist designated as the avatar of postmodern radicality, mingling with collectors, because their seeming incompatibilities are the subject of the day. And Smithson, not only because his spiral jetty is considered the icon of earthworks, that earliest form of land art that developed into distinct tangents, such as Michelle Stewart's astronomically oriented stone alignment solstice cairns of 1979. And not because his work coalesces all the contradictions of the art of that tumultuous 60s, when painting became temporarily obsolete, yet color transferred to sculpture. Then sculpture as a three-dimensional object you encircled, such as this 63 David Smith, stretched into an environment you traversed, per Walter de Maria's demand at his mid-70s lightning field in New Mexico, for a minimum of 18 hours and a sleepover with strangers. Being married, David and I won the soul double bed. Oops. Not just because Smithson made what some think of as the model of art as gallery and collector thwarting, being huge, distant, mutable, but which became a popular pilgrimage site prompting extensive merchandising. All these productively complicate a work of art's collectability. But more relevantly, no work of art from the late 60s influenced the course of art as much as did Smithson verbally. In 1972, he summarized for an interviewer, "Art has tended to be viewed in terms of isolation, neutralization, separation. Art is supposed to be free from the experiences of the world, and I'm more interested in art as part of that experience." All these factors come into it. A few months later, amidst its coverage of Documenta, Artforum reprinted Smithson's participation in that German international exhibition. Not a sculpture. It was an 850-word proclamation of independence, testimonially signed. Cultural confinement, Smithson asserted, takes place when a curator imposes his own limits on an art exhibition, rather than asking an artist to set his limits. Museums, like asylums and jails, have wards and cells. In other words, neutral rooms called galleries. All is reduced to visual fodder and transportable merchandise. He could say that because the John Weber Gallery in Soho, which as the successor to the Douane represented him, did not give grub stakes for earthworks. At the time, he had the gift of being able to make personal conflicts, his dread of oppression, displayed in his 1959 Purgatory, speak to public ones, here, the emerging practice of institutional critique. So today we first need to consider some of those factors that made the artist want to be, and the art appear to be, uncollectible. Abstract expressionism and its dilution in color fields had painted themselves into a corner. The arena of art making that displayed most strongly that sense of potentiality endemic to the 60s was that of sculpture. And the expanding economy and expansive social mood, dominated by those of us whose post-war births ballooned the birth rate, became young adults, swelling artists' ambitions, and sculpture into engorgement. In 1969, for an exhibition as bluntly titled as the forms it displayed, Scale as Content, Ronald Blayton's X occupied the atrium of the Corcoran in D.C. Size mattered and performed intransigence. Absolutely site-specific, X rose inside the colonnade by being made on the spot out of common plywood, and like Alice, seemed to want to break through classicism's columns. Those years were exhilarating, critic Lucy Lepard recalled. There was a sense of possibility, of rebellion against the looming authorities and institutions of the recent past, a desire for new ways of conceiving of, experiencing, and distributing art. Over the decade of the 60s, the increasing proportion of citizens against the Vietnam War produced a sea change of skepticism manifested in what political theorist Herbert Marcuse called, as part of youth's demands for a liberated society, the great refusal of multiple forms of conventionality considered repression. X's challenge to objet d'art as portable domestic-sized collectible propelled those refusals outward, as we see in Stuart's Cairns in Oregon, Nancy Holt's Sun Tunnels in Utah, and Dennis Oppenheim in his Branded Mountain in the Bay Area and Canceled Crop in the Netherlands, where the grain was symbolically withheld from the market as a surrogate refusal of art commodification. In Smithson's library, Art and Confrontation, The Arts in an Age of Change, an anthology published shortly after France's May '68 nationwide strike, denounces, quote, the subjection of artists to restrictions that are inherent in merchandise fetishism, and revolution is hopeless unless accompanied by a fervent aspiration toward purity. This was the zeitgeist so perfectly expressed by Oppenheim in the spring of '68 that it was repeatedly quoted. In the New York Times, Grace Gluck reported, "It stems from a need to get out of the galleries," says Oppenheim in what may be the understatement of the year. "I have a need to get out of the galleries," he told National Observer. The fact that the occasion that prompted Oppenheim to utter this mantra was a show in a would-be commercial establishment did not appear to the critics to be disingenuous. Dennis Oppenheim's sculpture was alive and growing, John Gibson heralded the press release put out by the adventurous art dealer, whose projects for commissions dealt in a kind of futures, potential works made upon order. Oppenheim personified the conflict of both disdaining the constraints and market association of a gallery and longing for the recognition that an exhibition elicits. And collectors mostly did not feel the need to follow anyone out of the galleries. The experience of collecting was not only being thwarted, but extended. The idea of environmental art began with minimalism's promotion of interactive absorption. Placed on the floor in a grid, Robert Morris's 4 22-inch square mirrored cubes from 1965, being cubic, are in orientation individually neither horizontal nor vertical. The ray becomes lateral, a stage for movement throughout the dispersed low elements, which fluctuate between boxes outlined in black and planes vaporizing into ambient space. And we only know that by getting in the middle of it. As Gaston Bachelard would say, the resonances it evokes, now you see it, now you don't, reverberate in us. Mobile experience of the reductive art objects engenders corporeal awareness of one's own height, girth, and ironically, transience. The French philosopher of the poetic imagination, who all sculptors read at that time, wrote, "We must participate actively in the creating imagination to situate awareness in the present." In its simplistic Marxism, Art and Confrontation claimed, in the last analysis, the condition of the artist depends on the market. For a while in the early 70s, that did not pertain. Some were freed from economic constraints on the production of challenging sculpture by the unconstrained support of Virginia Dwan, who had inherited wealth. She funded the land purchase and construction of Michael Heiser's double negative northeast of Las Vegas. Heiser cut 2 long troughs into a mesa, the walls 50 feet high. With a chasm in between, they span 1,500 feet. It's an isolation, depth, and expanse you can only begin to comprehend by on-the-ground experience after an arduous trip up the mesa and around to find it, as I did during dissertation research in arid 115 degrees, lizards skittering by. Heiser had voiced the period's antagonism against galleries and their affluence of customers, but his way out of the art market was a return to reverence, stating, "One of the implications of earth art might be to remove completely the commodity status of a work of art and allow a return to the idea of, well, I'm thinking of religion. In the desert," he continued, "I can find that kind of unraped, peaceful, religious space artists have always tried to put into their work. Those figures of speech are charged, especially by a sculptor penetrating what was known as the Virgin River Valley." Heiser's analogies also call up an earlier revulsion against filthy lucre and the retreat to an isolated religious space seen across the Frick's Garden Court, St. Francis in the Desert, Bellini's tender portrayal of the mendicant friar who refused to touch money. Both works of art also promote French philosopher Simone Weil's statement, absolutely unmixed attention is prayer. Experiencing anything with meditative focus, for the time being, it becomes ours, even as it possesses us. Heiser, like Oppenheim, ameliorated his idealistic reluctance to be associated with commerce by showing with a sympathetic dealer who was not actually making money doing so. Virginia functioned simultaneously as a dealer, patron, and collector, as she became owner of the double negative and in 1985 donated it to the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles. So here's the irony that sculptor Clement Meadmore pointed out shortly after Dwan's Earthworks show in October '68. While the artists are pretending not to be interested in art, dealers are proving that for themselves, art is indeed a primary involvement. A sampler of works in Earthworks demonstrates the period's disparate ownership destinations. Smithson's non-site bins, containing ore from the vicinity of its corresponding site at Franklin Mines, New Jersey, along with aerial photographs, a text, and the snapshots are seen here. It was soon purchased by the Chicago collector Louis Manilow, who in 1979 donated it to the institution where he was founder and president of the board, Chicago's Museum of Contemporary Art. Morris's pile of scavenged earth, peat, grease, felt, brick, and bits of metal, earthwork, evocatively captured the devastated social body in fall '68, after that year's public assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, the general strike in France, police brutality against protesters at the Chicago Democratic Convention, and the unceasing virulence of the Vietnam War, when draft took a wide swath of our brothers. It was not collected at the time, more like swept up, but it has been recreated. It is now on view at Dia in a white box, where without knowledge of 1968, its insolence can appear insular, even forlorn. Behind Morris's pile was an early example, maybe the first, of what Sol LeWitt would later sell as designated art, instructions. John Weber, the director of Dwan's gallery, produced it according to directions sent by Walter de Maria from Munich, where he had made his first earth room. Its title, etched on the metal plaque in the center, "The Color Men Choose When They Attack the Earth," ostensibly refers to that of Caterpillar earth-moving equipment. De Maria was a reticent person who, in his work, made grandiose gestures. His 20-foot-wide statement can be taken as the show's sole address of emerging environmentalism, but it would also be the artist's only one. And it was the only work to have directly sold from this show for $3,000. But De Maria's correspondence with Robert Scull suggests that the collector received it in return for funding the creation of some of De Maria's ephemeral drawings on desert playa. After being auctioned in 1986 to Jacques Janou, it was purchased in 2006 by the Menil Collection in Houston, where we can see it. Scull was also the funder of Heiser's 9 Nevada depressions, dug on government-owned lake beds in Nevada. One of these, Dissipate, 5 shallow trenches in the configuration of matchsticks dropped onto paper, was documented in Earthworks by a 6-foot square backlit photograph. Dissipate was recreated twice, temporarily as a 40th anniversary homage by a camper of the Burning Man congregation, and permanently for the Menil's verdant lawn. Again, the relocation absolutely neutralized its audacity, which we have to say is also true of Caravaggio, Cubism, and every other radical style that history and institutions have incorporated and defanged. Scull was the other major collector who had both the will and the resources to fund acres for artists. He made a fortune from his father-in-law's taxi fleet, a business then known for its ties to the mob, by inaugurating the installation of two-way radios and renaming it Skulls Angels to emphasize that their cars were guardians who could fly to customers upon their calls. While his support of Heiser was on view in Earthworks, manic journalist Tom Wolfe described Skull and his wife Ethel, pictured recently at the Warhol extravaganza at the Whitney, as folk heroes of every social climber who ever hit New York. In a blaze of publicity, they illuminated the secret route, collecting whacked-out art. But it was Skull who made an astute distinction. If one buys a work of art, he's still a collector. The minute a collector says to an artist, "I see you're struggling. Here is some money. Don't give me anything now." Now you're dealing with it in terms of involving yourself in the creative life of a human being who has got something that you find very significant, or some poetry that makes you shell out money and say, "Here, do it." And then you become a patron, and that's a whole other trip. So it's appropriate that the Frick Center for Collecting leaps forward to the 20th century with the trip of funding in Uncollectibles, because it adapted the pre-modern practice typified by Rembrandt of being professionally sustained by patrons, such as cloth merchant and self-styled intellectual Jan Six, who Rembrandt portrayed twice. Another dealer who needs to be acknowledged for his patronage of Smithson was Douglas Christmas. They became friends while working together on a Vancouver project where Christmas had a gallery. Then Christmas substantially funded Smithson's film on the jetty and showed it in his LA Ace Gallery. Like Rembrandt, these modern recipients of patronage have a closer relationship than they would to collectors who just buy things. Heiser made a portrait of Virginia, highlighting it at an exhibition of her collection. And on a later terrace, Smithson hung out here. It was Virginia's. But such social leveraging of support for the creation of whacked-out art did not seem to have been common knowledge, as indicated by Warren Miller's 1972 cartoon, in which a man resembled Skull beguiles a voluptuous babe. And I can tell you've already read that offer. In his anti-institutional voice that summer, Smithson typed a private, "And folks, never before seen before this moment," riposte across an enlarged copy. To those who consider things sanely, it is evident that divine providence counsels the rich to use well those goods that they possess in transitory fashion if they wish for eternal recompense. He quoted William of Aquitaine in 910, granting land for Cluny, the monastery, as stated in the book in his library, Art and Architecture in Medieval France. But Smithson's caution also presciently applied to artists' ambitions. In November 1973, 4 months after Smithson's death, De Maria wrote Virginia, seeking support for a larger lightning field than the initial one in Arizona she had funded, noting, "I have come to realize that the land or earth movement as a whole is best advanced through fewer major statements rather than a profusion of smaller ones, as he had been doing." He promised fame, a lightning field with the dimensions of a mile square of land could constitute one of the major sculptures of the movement and perhaps a major statement of 20th century art. It worked. Eventually funded by the Dia Foundation, the lightning field has appeared on many book covers and inspired musicians and poetry. It is maintained by a group of private collectors, Foundation, Gagosian Gallery, Gucci, and Prada. In 1969, the sculptural transgressions on the Dwan Gallery's floor had joined others designated as impossible art. A decade later, another cartoon by Miller showed an earthen pile as a businessman's office decor. Again, as throughout the history of art, what once was considered obstreperously alienating had been assimilated. Yet notable about land art of the 70s was not only a return to prominent patronage, but how it offered a new set of collecting experience, which was the collecting of experience. In the 1970s, several artists constructed remotely located naked eye observatories, suggesting an intrigue not only with astronomical but cosmic universes. With its constellations cut into concrete pipes, whose orientation make them lenses onto the rising and setting of the sun at solstices and equinoxes, Holt combined Heiser's sense of compression between his tall walls and the expansion implied by Smithson's spiral. Built and owned privately by Holt, it was acquired last year by Dia. Morris's observatory was commissioned by Netherlands' countrywide sculpture exhibition Sonsbeek in 1971. Then public funding enlarged it at the new post-war town of Lelystad, an hour northeast of Amsterdam. Oriented to solstice and equinox sightlines, it has 2 concentric rings of earth, 4 notched openings, and is a lushly beautiful sight to run around in and out through these apertures. In the Heiser mode of working endlessly in a remote desert hermitage is Charles Ross's huge star axis, begun in 1976 on a mesa in New Mexico, a hybrid of intricately designed sculpture and precisely aligned observatory. Over many years, Virginia has been a substantial contributor. Ross established the nonprofit Landlight Foundation as a vehicle for tax-deductible donations. At his Arizona mountain, Roden Crater, James Turrell carved the caldera of an extinct volcano into a symmetrical bowl with subterranean channels from which to view the hemisphere above. Since 1974, although as time goes on, he won't acknowledge that early date, Turrell has received funding from the NEA, every major foundation, many private collectors such as Count Ponza, but it remains unfinished, as if a cash cow. A couple of decades ago, David and I climbed up to the top with the rancher caretaker, who told me that Turrell was buying the surrounding land, grazing cattle, and running them to Kansas City stockyards. A few years ago, when I was living nearby in Flagstaff during an NEH seminar for a few weeks, his Skyscone Foundation refused admission, informing me that no one could yet view it. That is, unless offering a donation, like the $10 million that Kanye West, our latest patron of the Uncollectible, gave Turrell last December so that, as the rapper put it, Roden Crater could be experienced and enjoyed for eternity. Or maybe he meant for eternal recompense. Here is Kanye with his new chum a couple of weeks later at Turrell's show at Mass MoCA, his art patronage perhaps an echo of that of his one-time mentor and current pal, Jay-Z, become celebrity visitor to the Louvre with Beyoncé. But no matter. Last summer, at an easy drive outside of Den Haag, above North Sea dunes, where a sign promises the presence of light can be so tangible, I experienced Turrell's smaller 1996 celestial vault. My guide was the perfect link to the Frick now a year later, the eminent Rembrandt scholar Gary Schwartz, on the left with his wife Loki, and contemplating the universe. And here I am, zoned out, daydreaming, experientially owning the great celestial vault, now recollected in memory and on iCloud. And you too can give this work and the hemisphere above attention, what Weil aptly called the rarest and purest form of generosity, and collect memories of transient ownership, the celestial vault, and most other magisterial works of land art wait for you. Thank you.